En met daardie aanspraak is die AWP bereid om die dood tegemoet te gaan. Hulle kry nie ons land nie. Ons sal die ANC gelyk maak met wapengeweld in hierdie land voor hulle.
Wathinda thina, wathinda bangasokufa, safa saphenduka saphenduka nje bovu.
Greetings to all the forces, and thank you very much for tuning in. Forces of Black Power, Forces of the Revolution, and Forces of Black Excellence. So the episode of this week, which is episode number 2, is titled The Hidden Truth About OraniaTown. As we know, OraniaTown is a festering sore on the landscape of South Africa, which represent the epitome of privilege, segregation, and willful ignorance. So today, I want to unravel for you the hidden truth about this blight on our nation. So Orania, draped in the guise of Afrikaner self-determination, is nothing more than a refugee for conservative Afrikaners clinging desperately to their outdated beliefs and ideas of supremacy. Under the facade of autonomy, they perpetuate a system of exclusion, discrimination, and apartheid-era nostalgia that has no place, if we are to be honest, in our modern society. So Gayton Mackenzie, who is the leader of the Patriotic Alliance movement in 2023, paid a visit to Orania and returned with stories alleging that the African National Congress, the ANC, had sanctioned the sale of the land and legitimized Orania. This encouraged me to actually embark on months of research and article writing. I found myself deeply frustrated, like a lot of South Africans, grappling with the conundrum of how can such a town which resembles the apartheid system exist in our democratic society, and especially considering our troubled history under this racist. And recently, Peniel the Black Pen also paid a visit to Orania and had an interview with Yesa Stradom. Apologies if I didn't get the pronunciation right, but I think it's Yesa Stradom. So on that whole podcast, what Yesa Stradom basically did is to give out information about Orania from a wide Afrikaner perspective. And if you look at history, this is facts. One thing that white people have mastered is to manufacture their own history or reshape the history and information to paint a certain image. And I'm not going to lie, yes, Yesa Stradom said a lot of good stuff, which, like everyone, I believe that we can learn from Orania. But unlike others, I won't sit here and glorify an apartheid town. That's something that I'm not going to do. It's either something is right or wrong. But unfortunately, that's not always, sorry, my phone is actually almost fell. But yeah, unfortunately, it's not always the case when it comes to liberal societies, because liberal societies always fail to look at things in that way. They never agree on one thing because they're not true, obviously, to their moral values and beliefs. And that's something that we have always seen most of the time. And Yesa Stradom's first lie on the Peniel podcast, I think, which is now being called Convo, I think something like that. But what he basically done, his first lie was to state that Orania is not as an end result of the apartheid system. That's very unapologetic and shit. Since I have the information, I thought it's best that I share with the forces of our nation. I'm just a guy who's going to state the facts, and I aim to explain the history of Orania in the most clearest way. In order to have a full comprehension of what I'm going to articulate about, let's start with the term apartheid. So the term apartheid was coined by the National Party in 1948 when they took power, and the term obviously does not have a single meaning. But however, the fundamental tenets of the term apartheid have been interpreted to include racial segregation, group division, the maintenance and continued existence of the Western capitalism system, the exploitation of cheap labor, and I want you to get this one, the preservation of white Afrikaner identity. It is not rocket science to get to the conclusion that in order to formally pronounce the apartheid system dead in South Africa, this characteristic or components that I mentioned must be fully destroyed, which is not the case in South Africa. Hence, we are here speaking about Orania. And just to give a brief about OraniaTown, Orania is a town. It's not a country. It's a town. So that one is clear already. So the town of Orania is located in the region of Northern Cape, just I think it's 400 kilometers from Pretoria. And it stands out as a distinct enclave within the borders of the country. And it is a white-only town. of a population of around 3,000 people, and is mainly dominated by white Afrikaner-speaking white people, white Afrikaners. And not everyone can live in Orania, and in order to live in Orania, you need to apply for citizenship, and the requirements are as follows. You have to be a white Afrikaner, be a Calvinist Christian, and have a clear criminal record, and only speak Afrikaans within the borders of Orania. So, in the words of Jesus Stradum, Orania is an Afrikaner community, so you have to be an Afrikaner. Being white does not qualify you to live in Orania. And also, just to clear this, black people are not allowed in Orania to stay in Orania, obviously, because there's no black Afrikaner. But just to also touch on this, normally South Africans tend to view the white English-speaking and the white Afrikaner-speaking people with the same lens. And these two groups are actually two separate communities that have had considerable impacts on the socio-political landscape of the nation and have a very huge history in South Africa. The English-speaking white people are from the British Empire, while the Afrikaners are the descendants of the Dutch, French, German, and the Dutch, French, and German settlers of the Cape, those that settled in 1652. And these two groups have fought for a very long time, fighting for power and domination within South African borders. And one of their biggest war, I think, is the Anglo-Boer War. So Afrikaners have always believed in superiority of their race. So following the formation of the Union of South Africa, they gained a momentum driven by a desire to assert Afrikaner culture, language, and political power. Fast forwards in 1948, the Afrikaner National Party won and took government from the English-speaking whites. The National Party started to write the apartheid system into law, and causing all these divisions that we have currently. How did Orania come to being? So during the 80s and 90s, apartheid was about to end in South Africa. The country was unruly, and there was a lot of sanction which made the operation of the country very difficult. The apartheid was actually in crisis from 1978. And this is the period where the release of Nelson Mandela becomes an option to work towards ending apartheid and the commencement of negotiations. Part of the reason the negotiation took place was also to make sure that in post-apartheid South Africa, white people will be protected and secured. And during this historical period in our country, there was a lot of resistance among the conservative Afrikaners who wanted to preserve their culture, obviously the apartheid culture, as we were moving towards a new democratic South Africa, which was going to be led by black people. It was already obvious in the 1990s that the ANC was going to take over. So a lot of white people couldn't imagine being led by black people and having the same rights as black people. So others packed their bags and left for Europe. And now this is where Orania begins. Exactly in December 1990, 40 Afrikaner families led by Karel Bishop, the son-in-law of the Prime Minister of South Africa, Hendrik Verwoerd, bought OraniaTown for about 1.5 million. He bought 8,000 hectares of land, and the first inhabitants, the first people, the white people obviously, moved to Orania in 1991 in April. And since the town was actually was occupied by colored community, and they were moved to surrounding towns, Orania established their first transnational representative in 1995, and they got a visit from our own Nelson Mandela during that year as part of a reconciliation program. I don't know what they were reconciling because, they didn't want to get close to us. Now, let's take a step back to the negotiation because a lot actually transpired during this period. A lot of Afrikaners did not like the idea of the multiracial election that was proposed by the African National Congress and other organization. So during this negotiation period, the National Party, Democratic Party, and the IFP advocated for a decentralized system of government that will allow them to maintain power in their more localized area, while the ANC was saying, no, we want a centralized government where there's only going to be one party, which is what we have now. So the conservative Afrikaners wanted and demanded that if that's going to happen, then they want their own land or own white territory, which they refer to as a Volksstaat, in order to preserve their culture and not be part of a democratic society where they're going to be mixed up with other races. While the nation was planning and negotiating towards a transition to democracy, there's a group of Afrikaners who resisted during this negotiation. Who resisted actually the negotiation. Some Afrikaners became concerned about the future of their community within a democratic South Africa. They feared being marginalized or persecution in a society where they will no longer hold the power, the political power they had and enjoyed under the apartheid system. I have heard a lot of stories about people saying that Orania is a town that was allocated to white people who fear that black people, when they get the political power, they will retaliate. That is fallacious and nonsensical narrative. There's conservative Afrikaner leaders threatened to bring South Africa to its knees in post-apartheid South Africa if the ANC did not cater for establishment of a white-only territory. They utilized things like threats of violence, and they threatened to damage the economy of South Africa utilizing a collective force. It was not an easy thing. These people were prepared to make sure that when we transition to democracy, at least they will still be able to practice the apartheid within the borders of the country. As I mentioned, the Afrikaner community is a community that believes in the superiority of their race, as they are the descendants of the German, Dutch, and French. They believe that they are from South Africa. They are indigenous people. They see themselves as indigenous people. This is why they want to practice their idea in South Africa, and they are doing it, unfortunately. One of the incidents is the Afrikaner Festbach, the AWB, or Afrikaner Resistance Movement members, breaking into the conference center while the negotiations were going on and committed various acts of destruction to threaten the participants in the negotiation. They were not backing down, and their actions made it clear and sent out a loud message. So the AWB was a far-right movement, a white supremacist organization in South Africa that emerged during the apartheid era, during the end of the apartheid era, known for its radical and violent opposition to dismantling apartheid and the transition to democracy. They didn't want that had to happen. So the AWB carried out various acts of terrorism and violence throughout the negotiations. And so the ANC agreed to hold negotiation with the Afrikaner Volksstaat movement, which later became the Freedom Front. The ANC was scared that if they didn't hold the talks or negotiation, there was going to be a coup d'etat. So because the angry members of the Afrikaner community, especially the conservative Afrikaners, were part of the South Africa Defense Force. There were also plans to boycott the 1994 democratic elections. So there were a lot of threats and violence and high level of violence that was taking place during the negotiation. And on the other side, the ANC, the African National Congress, was rather advocating for a peaceful transformation. Hence, the talks continued and an agreement was officially reached and signed on the 23rd of April 1994, just 3 days before the first democratic election, the first multiracial election. April 23rd, 1994, at Pretoria, the Accord on Afrikaner Self-Determination between the Freedom Front, the African National Congress, and the SA government, the National Party, was signed. This is a very imperative document that was signed, which led to the recognition of Orania in South Africa. This document was signed by Thabo Mbeki, representing the ANC, Constant Visual, representing the Freedom Front. Remember, I said it's the Afrikaner Volksstaat. And Ruth Meyer, who was representing the SA government of that time, which is the National Party. Now, why is this document important? This document is very important because it contains 8 crucial agreements, and I'll just basically summarize them. I think I have them in front of me, so yeah, I'll just briefly go through them. So, through a process of negotiation, address the idea of Afrikaner self-determination, including the concept of Volksstaat. The second one is non-exclusion of the possibility of local or regional and other forms of self-determination. The third one is the outcome of the talks or the negotiation will be based on broad support for Afrikaner self-determination and shared values, including democracy, anti-racism, basic human rights, and the encouragement of peace and inter-ethnic harmony. The fourth one is the support for the idea of self-determination. The support of the idea of self-determination will be measured by elections. And then the fifth is the establishment of the Forestry Council. This Forestry Council will investigate potential Afrikaner self-determination mechanism. The government of South Africa will receive reports from the Forestry or whatever council. Number six, parties agree that the Forestrat will form such bodies as freely, so they will be autonomous in terms of forming their own bodies. And then 7, during the negotiations of the Afrikaner self-determination, the parties will also discuss among themselves and reach agreement about the perceived consequences of the outcome of the negotiations for the agriculture sector. And then number 8, the parties further agree that they will also discuss all matters of concern by negotiation, the possibilities of international mediation to help resolve such matters as may be in dispute or difficult to conclude will not be excluded. I think I'll also try to, I actually have the document, so I'll just put it on the screen so that everyone can see. The Interim Constitution was amended then to cater for the Volksraad Council and its right to self-determination. The South African Constitution, which was signed by Thabo Mbeki in 1996, Article 235 was integrated in. So Orania is protected by Article 235 and arguably Article 185 as well of the Constitution. So Orania does not exist independently from the Republic. So to wrap it up, I'm just gonna give my own view why I don't support Orania. So if you are a South African and you are pro-democracy, regardless of the color of your skin, you cannot support Orania. It can only be a delusional person who will suggest that Orania existing within the borders of this country, a democratic country, is a good thing for the Afrikaners. Orania is a threat to South Africa for multiple reasons. Number one, Orania already undermines the concept of the Rainbow Nation, which was coined by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and also undermines the country's big mission of nation building on constitutional values because it doesn't align with our constitution, but it's still part of us. And then it goes without saying that Orania is an apartheid legacy. And for that, it continues a dark history of apartheid in South Africa. The struggle for the triumph of the apartheid system was very fundamental to South Africans. A mission of having an inclusive and an equal democratic country. Therefore, in a democratic society, the existence of Orania, which is built on the fallacious idea of Afrikaner superiority to other races, the preservation of African culture, racism, and exclusive society undermines the constitution of our country, the struggle of African people, and the idea of democracy as well. And that makes South Africa still a conquered nation, a country with an illusion of democracy, and one of the only countries probably in Africa that still practices apartheid. Remember, Orania is legal part of South Africa and within the borders of our country. That's very scary. It's very essential to make sure that everyone has the right to live and be anywhere where they want to be in our nation without any fear or prejudice or the exclusion in a democratic society. It doesn't make any sense that there's a certain group of people that cannot live within Orania. It doesn't really matter what they are trying to do. We are living in South Africa and you need to abide by the laws of this country. You're not superior to anybody. And the other thing that people always fail to have a long-term view when it comes to these things. And the history has taught us that that failure can lead to problematic issues. For instance, let's say we need to have a giraffe view when it comes to this Orania thing, because for now, Orania is 3,000 people. Maybe a lot of people don't see this as a threat. But what's going to happen when Orania population grows? Orania is a desert already. We know it's in the middle of a desert. And the land is not even that big. So when the population grows, there was going to be a need to extend. And that extension, where are they going to extend to? To South Africa? Huh? we see what I'm trying to say. So Orania is a threat to South Africa. That one goes without saying, and people need to understand this. It doesn't really matter what they have built. Yeah, they have done what they have done for themselves. But then, if you care about the future of this country, what is going to happen in the next 100 years, 150 years, when Orania becomes a big thing, and now they want to take over South Africa again? We cannot be foolish at this point. We should learn from our history. We shouldn't allow to be controlled. We shouldn't be allowed the apartheid system to still exist in South Africa. It might seem like a small thing currently because I'm sorry, there's one of my friends that is putting his earphone. Allow Orania to exist in South Africa. And then if they want to practice the apartheid system, they have to do it somewhere else, not within the borders, because they are a threat to South Africa. And then it's very important for people to get this.